20 speaking characters, demonic possession, evil twins. Is this Days of Our Lives or Chris Claremont X-Men? You'll find out on Dear Watchers, an omniversal comic book podcast where we do a deep dive into the multiverse.
We are traveling with you through the stories and the worlds that make up the omniverse of fictional realities we all love. And I love both Days of Our Lives and X-Men. And your watchers on this journey are me, Guido.
And me, Rob. I'm trying to think of some... There's too many X-Men to name, so I'll just go with my own name.
And there is an X-Men in these books with my name, so...
Oh, that's true. Oh my gosh, so you are
incredibly unusual that
X-Men.
I get the chance to say that, but this is one of those times.
Yes, and before we begin today's trip, what's new in our little section of the multiverse, Guido?
Please call me Strong Guy.
Oh, of course. I'm sorry. Do we know if it's pronounced like your name? Or
no, of course we don't know, and I'm going to assume it's not, but that's okay. Let's make it.
Yes.
Growing up, I always imagined it was, but then as I, over the many, many years of my life, discovered that everyone says Guido, I was like, oh, okay, maybe it's Guido Carosella, but we're going to go with Guido Carosella.
He's one of my favorite, I think, X-Men characters of the hundreds to choose from, but he's up there for me, so maybe that's why I gravitated to you.
Yes, I guess so. And with that, this is kind of a classic episode, which we haven't done for a while. We've done some shorter stories. We've done lots of non-Marvel, non-DC stories, our interviews, including our most recent with Tim Sheridan in our last episode, which if you haven't heard, go back and listen to. So it's fun, though, that we got back into a classic episode. And of course, what better property to do it with than X-Men, because in just a few weeks, X-Men 97 will be coming out, the new animated series continuing from the 1992 X-Men animated series. We also know that some X-Men characters are going to be in Deadpool and Wolverine, and so that trailer is out. We don't watch trailers, and for anyone considering not watching trailers, I highly recommend it. It's much more fun.
We haven't watched the X-Men 97 trailer either.
Nope, absolutely not. So thanks for being with us. This is an exciting episode to get back into.
And if you're joining us for the first time, we have 3 parts of our journey through the multiverse today: origins of the story, exploring multiversity, and pondering possibilities. So thanks for coming along.
And please remember, you can leave a 5-star review wherever you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify in particular, and find us on most social media at Dear Watchers.
And with that, dear watchers, welcome to episode 128, and let's check out what's happening in the Omniverse with our travels to today's alternate universe. Today, the claws come out, the 3 claws, that is, to
or
answer
6.
or 6, I guess that's true, to answer the question, what if Cable had destroyed the X-Men and Magneto took over the USA?
Oh, 2 questions. What is going on? We'll find out. But contrary to what Uatu says actually in one of these what if issues about there being infinite unnumbered realities, this world was numbered by the designation of the nerds online or at Marvel, who over the years have numbered everything. This is Earth 21993, which only has the appearances that we cover today. And we are going to dig into the X-Men. We have a lot of X-Men episodes over our 128 episodes. So you can go to dearwatchers.com. If you click episodes, there's a search box. You can find anything that we've covered in there. So put X-Men in and you will see lots of X-multiverse stories or X-Men related interviews and other things. So before we get into our origins of the story, a quick background on the moment this is taking place in. It's 91 to 93 is the span of stories we're covering today. And this is the moment the X-Men have taken over the world. In our world, the real world, the X-Men have taken over. So, of course, we are about to get the X-Men animated series in the middle of that stretch. right after the first story we read today, X-Men #1 hits. A few months later, it's likely the biggest selling comic ever to date with over 8 million copies. And we'll give a bit more background on the really iconic run of the creators of this story, Claremont and Lee, when we get into our first segment.
And let's, of course, we've talked about our backgrounds on X-Men ad nauseum on the podcast. So as you said, Guido, anyone can go back and listen to those there. So let's zoom into this moment of X-Men with Claremont and Lee. So what's your background with those two particular creators?
Well, as a fan of X-Men prior to this moment, I was a fan of their run, and I'll give a little bit more on their run when we get into it. So I read it as it came out. I reread it countless times as a child. I followed the careers of Claremont, not so much Lee, in part because of where he went and what happened and what he was doing. I like him a lot more now. And so I'd say I'm a big fan and pretty expert knowledge on the Claremont Lee era. I didn't even intend that. And how about you, this era of X-Men with these two at the helm? What's your background?
Well, this was very much the era that I was reading X-Men, probably starting with X-Men #1. Actually, no, starting with one of the issues that we're going to read today. That might have been one of my first X-Men comics that I ever had. But I had never really read the earlier Claremont until we discussed it really for this podcast. So this was really the Claremont era of X-Men that I was reading. And then also, of course, that iconic Jim Lee art. That was very much the look of the X-Men in my mind.
Yeah. So let's get into it.
Yeah, so we discussed our point of origin. So let's go back and talk origins of the story.
Right now, on this very show, you're going to get the answer to all your questions. Our amazing story begins a few years ago.
So we are discussing Uncanny X-Men Volume 1, issues 273 to 277. That's from February 1991 to June 1991. And those issues are Too Many Mutants, Crossroads, The Path Not Taken, Double Death, and Free Charlie.
And these are all written by Chris Claremont, though starting at 274, Jim is just co-credited. So it's by Chris Claremont and Jim Lee. They're no longer distinguishing the writing credit from the art credit. And he becomes the sole penciler, but he also later does some plotting. So he might have done some of the plotting in here. And of course, they're using the Marvel method anyway. So that's why that shift in credits is so key. But in issue 273, we do have a ton of other pencilers, and I'll explain probably why. So with Jim, we have Wells Portasio, Klaus Janson, John Byrne, Rick Leonardi, Mark Silvestri, Michael Golden, and Larry Stroman. Then across this run of issues, mostly inked by Scott Williams, Jim Lee's longtime collaborator, and a little bit of help from Carl Astelter. And colorists are Joe Rosas mostly, with some help from Glynis Oliver in an issue, letters by Tom Orzechowski, with some by Pat Brousseau, and edited by Bob Harris, with some crediting Suzanne Gaffney. So before we get into a summary of these issues, a little bit more on this Claremont Lee era. They start in on the X-Men together in 1989, so a few years prior to this being 91. They're, of course, a powerhouse team, though at the time, we have the veteran writer of Claremont. He's been on the book for over a decade, and the new hot artist, Jim Lee, who at the time hadn't really done much. I don't even know that we could say he was hot quite yet. I think this is part of what made him hot. So their run continues these few years, and this epic that we read is right in the heart of what would end up being the final act of their collaboration. It's like a wrap up, though it feels like it was probably intended to wrap up one act and transition us to another. But then, of course, whole lot of drama happens, I'll get to. The story follows the Extinction Agenda, so that's a crossover of all the X titles and all the teams, which is where all those other pencilers are coming into this book. They might have been providing support maybe, but as a bridge, it might have been a little bit because we're seeing all those teams in that first issue, and so they're drawing their characters in their panels. This leads into the Muir Island saga, which is a brief little crossover that hits right before the launch of X-Men #1, the big reboot, the mega moment referred to earlier, where we get the split into X-Men Blue, X-Men Gold, the X-Force debuts out of New Mutants, the new X-Factor team, the adjectiveless X-Men title, which is where Claremont and Lee go. And Claremont gets in some really intense fights with Marvel, probably specifically Bob Harris. And there's a few different stories as to why. I'm not going to dig in. He's said different things over the years. Other people have. But he abruptly leaves after writing X-Men #3. And, of course, ends up doing other X projects, including a return to the flagship book decades later. But this appears to have really stung and been a really hard time. So Jim Lee picks it up, starts the plotting, but then meanwhile himself goes out to form Image Comics in the radical reshaping of the industry, and that's at X-Men 11. So Lee doesn't last much longer than Claremont at this point. So again, feels like they were setting up a lot and what would maybe have been a big mega arc, but this ends up being the major moment before we get that almost epilogue that X-Men 1 through 3 have become over the years. So tell us, why don't you kick off our summary of what's happening across these 5 issues?
Okay, we're going to try to make this as brief as possible because there's a lot going on. So
they're very dense.
Broad strokes here.
Yes.
So, overseeing a large, unruly team, Storm isn't sure what the next step with leading the X-Men should be, and some, like Cable, want her to take a more forceful approach.
But before she can do anything about it, Lila Cheney appears and teleports Storm, Wolverine, Jubilee, Gambit, and Forge to the Shi'ar galaxy, who've been summoned by Deathbird to kill Professor X.
The team defeat Deathbird and are reunited with Charles, but soon Gambit and Jubilee learn that Charles is in fact controlling Lilandra and is a ruthless warlord. Gambit and Jubilee escape, but are unable to warn their teammates. Wolverine suspects something and kills Charles. And now the Shi'ar turn against the X-Men.
The X-Men are saved by Deathbird, and it's soon revealed that the dead Charles was in fact a war Skrull, and they've had the real Charles captive. So the Skrulls created a fake Charles, a fake Wolverine, a fake Jubilee, and end up fighting Deathbird, joining Storm, Gambit, and Forge. They defeat the evil Skrulls, and Charles senses a thread that Claremont's been setting up here, which is a disturbance from the Shadow King, and realizes that they need to return.
Meanwhile,
there's this one interlude, though it relates to our multiverse, and it's just such a good issue. So yeah, what does that interlude?
Yeah, so Magneto and a depowered Rogue are living in the Savage Land, fending off Zaladane and her minions as she tries to expand her reach beyond the Savage Land. Together with Ka-Zar and Nick Fury, they defeat Zaladane and Rogue powers return. Yay! Magneto captures Zaladane, but against the wishes of the others, he kills her.
Right, which positions him to be the villain that he is in X-Men #1, which is a really important beat for that big relaunch. So there's a lot going on in here. I had us read it because it's a really fun arc, I think. And while our multiverse doesn't pull on too many of these threads, I just thought, all right, if we're going to dig into this moment, this era, let's really get a glimpse. So what was your feeling since it was your first exposure to it?
Well, I mentioned soap operas in my kickoff, and I know it's kind of a tired thing to call X-Men a soap opera, and we've certainly done it on the podcast before, but I get really so many soap opera elements of this with this huge cast and kind of traditional things like evil twins, or here they're Skrulls, I guess, and the demonic possession from the Shadow King. And there's just all these things. They don't have too much romance really in these issues, which
Oh my
I know.
gosh. No, I think they do.
Really?
Well, they have, you know what
Here?
they have?
No.
They have a lot of sexuality, and that's sort of
That's
the
true.
difference and it's partially Lee's art, but it's always Claremont's writing. Like there's Jean Grey showering and having a conversation with Psylocke, and there's
Yes.
of course Rogue's mega famous outfit, and then Rogue's Savage Land outfit, and then Magneto is naked for much of the Savage Land battle. So yeah, I think
That's true.
there's a lot of flesh, but I guess
That's
there's
true.
not a lot of relationships happening.
The classic Jean and Scott and Gambit and Rogue aren't really present in these issues here in that way.
Well,
But yeah, I mean,
because there's so much going
yeah.
on.
Oh yeah, so there's just so much going on, and it felt like to me, like, Guido, were these actually longer issues or longer than modern comics, or do they just feel that way because there's so much packed in there?
They feel that way because of Claremont's writing. 275 is an anniversary issue, so it was double length.
Okay.
But otherwise, they were all standard. And actually, I think 274 feels like one of the longest, and that's the main Savage Land issue. And I think it's really from his. It's narrated by Magneto, and so there's just so much writing in the caption boxes that I love, and is giving you a sense of Magneto and this really important moment in his arc. But yeah, it's like reading a novel, really.
Yeah.
So
what did you think revisiting this? Obviously, this is something that you've read many times before.
yeah, I think it's just such a good example. It's not either of their best stories, Claremont or Lee, but I think it's such a good example of what they were doing and the strengths they each have. Claremont, we've teased how much he overwrites, and sure, is he doing that here? Yes, but I like it. I like it because I was explaining to you after we read, like, there are so many strands he's picking up from his over 10, 15 years at this point on the book. And there's so much he's setting up. And that is how it is, like, almost like Days of Our Lives or countless other soap opera-y type things. Even a lot of prestige dramas.
Oh, totally.
And genre shows are like that, where they're threading things that are going to pay off 10 issues later. You know, in the first issue there, we get the sequence with Jean trying to use Cerebro because they're all figuring out now what to do. Now, Xavier has been gone in our world time for a decade. And so he's actually been gone for a really long time. But this is the first time the team is back at the mansion, figuring out what to do. They have these new mutants who are just so strange to them. They haven't become X-Force yet. So when Jean tries to use Cerebro, she encounters Shadow King. It feels like just a little beat to explain why they can't use Cerebro. But of course, it's setting up that 7 issues later, there's going to be a big showdown with Cerebro. With Shadow King. So it's just, that's what he does well. And then you pair that with Jim Lee's art, which is so dynamic and has so much action and has just extraordinary faces and incredible physiques. It's so good. It is essential X-Men.
Yeah, I mean, issue number 273 felt like, especially for someone like me who's not as familiar with where we were in the story, it felt like a TV show. Like you mentioned, like prestige dramas do this, like that TV show when you come back from like that year off between seasons, because now it's like, oh, Gambit's here and he's a brand new character, and Betsy Braddock
Storm
is in
just was
Psylocke's
returned to adult. And,
Betsy Braddock is in Psylocke's body, so there's all this stuff to like actually explain to the audience, and here are all these other characters. So issue number 273 especially is mostly just like, okay, this is where we're at now. But to your point, like, I think even seeing later after X-Men number 1, the team breaking off into these two teams, it almost makes sense. Like, it's seeded here because there's a lot of dialogue about, like, there's so many people and we're living on top of each other, and there's different
so
philosophies of how to do it. Yeah, and there's so many threats.
And
totally.
I think I think the opening of 273, the art and just the dialogue, I think is some of the best, because you've got Jean and Scott in their X Factory uniforms still, Storm now in her really iconic 90s action figure outfit, but with short hair because she was just re-aged. And then you have them looking around the world and seeing like, oh, we could go fight the Hand, or oh, there's Fenris is still out there. The Hellfire Club and the Morlocks are in New York, but the Reavers are still in Australia, because of course we just had the whole Outback run for many years. The Magistrates are in Genosha. We just had Extinction Agenda. They're still there. The Savage Land, like they're just mapping it out, and you're like, whoa, this world is huge, and how are they going to do this? And of course they do it through multiple titles in the franchise, as they had already been, but now they reboot them all, and it's a huge moment.
Yeah, I think though the hugeness of the world is something I don't love about this aspect of X-Men, because I never was a big fan of stuff out in the Shi'ar world, and I know X-Men get
off
very
our world then.
Off our world. Yeah, I know they get very cosmic, but to me, my mind always goes back to the X-Men being on Earth, dealing with humans. So I never really gravitated much to the Shi'ar storylines, which is most of these issues. So where do you land on the X-Men being like this cosmic team like the Fantastic Four?
They're not a cosmic team at all. There's a lot of Shi'ar that Claremont writes over the years, but I wouldn't call them that at all. And this run, I think he keeps it grounded. Again, he has to go there because it's the only way to get Xavier back. Xavier was taken by Lilandra to heal from wounds. The ship malfunctions and they can no longer come back to Earth. And then he's just gone and we don't really hear from him for years. So we have to go see what's going on there. But I actually like that it's the Skrulls. Like, sure, it's this alien race. I don't care if I know where the Skrulls are or what's going on. It makes sense that it's the Skrulls. It's fun. And I've always been a fan. The Starjammers were like the proto Guardians of the Galaxy, honestly.
Totally.
So I actually like the Starjammers. They're wacky and they're fun and they're weird.
I feel like their personalities, though,
credit.
Didn't really come through too much in these. Again, maybe because there's many characters.
That's part. And one thing I was saying to you when we finished reading, what is hard and amazing about this is Claremont was writing a giant epic soap opera. So yeah, you're barely seeing the Starjammers. They're on like 2 splash pages here, but that's only not satisfying if you haven't consumed the whole rest of the arc that he's doing, right? Like they only feel like underserved C characters, D-list characters even, because this is one tiny drop in a bucket of Claremont's story. So I think that's what's very hard. It's what makes Claremont's story almost impenetrable, is that like you really need a lot of the knowledge in order to enjoy moments like that and not have them feel really flat or two-dimensional. So I could see how like, Gladiator has like 2 lines in all of this. Like there's just not that much with the Imperial Guard or the Starjammers. But again, if you've been reading all of Claremont's run, like you know enough about them, you know who they are. It's cool that they like show up and Xavier is actually one of them and in this costume hidden. Now, that's the only plot piece that I think is a little undeveloped. I'm like the reveal that when he takes the mask off that it's Xavier. I'm like, I feel like we needed a little more build-up. So
like who was this mysterious one? And plus there's a big splash page that identifies everyone except that one helmeted character. So it was like, well, of course that's got to be Xavier, and it kind of looks similar to his House of X kind of era headwear.
But it also looks exactly like Strife's helmet.
It's very similar to Strife too.
At this point, so
yeah.
So
and I think also, it's funny because the Starjammers don't have much personality, and I think also because he's really enjoying writing some of these newer characters that had just been introduced, like Gambit and Jubilee. To me, like their personalities really jump out, and I think I can see him having fun with Gambit as a foil to Wolverine in a way that Scott couldn't really be a foil to Wolverine. Like, Scott's the polar opposite, but Gambit is kind of a similar character, and it's kind of that thing of like what happens when you put two similar characters almost butting heads. And then Jubilee as like that fresh, fun, like some of her lines are legitimately funny, I think, throughout like these issues.
Well, and they're both what they both are, and I think this is probably why all stories introduce new characters as they do, is they're both reluctant.
Yes.
Because at this point, you have the X-Men have been around for so long, even if in their Earth, in their set, in the sliding time scale of the Marvel Universe, maybe it's not that long. It's certainly not 30 years, which it was in real life at this point. But they've been around so long, they've cemented their heroism, if you will. But bring in these new characters and you call that into question. Like, there's one point where Gambit says, like, I guess when you're surrounded by all these heroes, you start to act that way. Like, he's not seeking to be a big hero, but he's learning that about himself. And then Jubilee, of course, is the Kitty Pryde, the kid who's there to be a little bit of the voice of the audience and be like, oh my God. And in this case, it's a little different. It's slightly more meta, actually, because she's like a fan of Lila Cheney, at least at this point. So she has that, like, again, audience, like, what if I was dropped into this? What would I do? And she's like that character.
But at the same time, it's fun because there's a line where Storm says, like, well, Storm and Wolverine, we've been off-world, but Gambit and Jubilee have never been off-world. And you have to, like, go, oh, okay, yeah, like, these are such new characters. And what's fun with Jubilee is, like, she doesn't even want to be. She's in outer space, and she could care less. Like, all she wants to do is get back home, which is also just such a teenager teenager way of thinking.
Yeah. So it's fun. I think it's a great moment in X history. I think it's not the most epic or iconic, but it's got some beautiful pages, covers, and art in amongst a really prototypical Claremont X-Men story.
And I was just going to say, I think before we move on, I think the secondary story, which only gets like an issue and a little bit of Magneto and Rogue, that was the one I really gravitated towards. And I think because that whole character arc with Magneto is so strong, and I do love like the moment when he kills Zaladane and he kills this other person as well, and like I think this is such a good balance between him being a villain and a hero and exploring what he's willing to do in this way. What did you think too about like this other story? And I know like I didn't even know this, but you were saying the image of Rogue here is so iconic as well.
Yeah, Savage Land Rogue is world famous. Very, very good costume design. Yes, she is not clothed, but even as someone who was not attracted to not clothed women, I found this to be an awesome costume choice. So again, he's setting up X-Men #1. He obviously at this point has it all plotted, if not written. So he knows the big X-Men #1 reboot is going to be Magneto is the villain again. Because Magneto has not been the villain at this point for over 10 years. So he's solidly been the X-Men's mentor. While Xavier's been gone, he's been their mentor. So it required setup to get him back to the place of villain. And so that's what you're seeing there. And that's why I think it's so good, because it's such a character-driven moment. And it's a really cool plot. I also was thinking, I wonder if it was some of the inspiration for the Savage Land plotting in the animated series, because the way that Claremont goes in and out of that story, and it doesn't totally tie in. Yeah. It doesn't need to. It's just almost a B story, which, I mean, Claremont has an A, B, C, D, E, F, and G story often going at the same time. But you know, it's the second issue is entirely in the Savage Land, and then you see those characters show up again, and so he's threading it through, and it made me think about, okay, the animated series is coming out a year later after this, and of course does that famously really well, where they have Xavier and Magneto trapped in the Savage Land, and just they would use the last few minutes of each episode to tell that story a little bit. So I thought, I bet they took inspiration from Claremont's structure here, his narrative structure. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited because Rockstar Layla Cheney is here, and wait, she wants me to come with her, and Lila Cheney, oh sure, and we can both go with her and teleport over to Exploring Multiversity.
I am your guide through these vast new realities. Follow me and ponder the question, what if?
And today we are asking the question, what if Cable had destroyed the X-Men and Magneto took over the USA? This is What If, second volume, issue number 46 from February 1993. What if Cable had destroyed the X-Men? And what if number 47, that's the very next issue from March 1993, what if Magneto took over the USA?
And they are formally part 1 of 2 and part 2 of 2. They're written by Kurt Busiek, penciled by Todd Smith, inked by Ian Aiken, colored by Evelyn Stein and Tom Vincent on the second issue, lettered by Janice Chang, former guest of our show. Go find our interview with the legend that is Janice, and edited by Craig Anderson and Linnair Brust on the second issue. So in terms of the creators, before we dig in, Kurt Busiek is a comic book legend at this point. Of course, he wrote The Marvels, the Alex Ross painted epic miniseries, this same year, 93. So he's not yet a legend, about to be, because prior to this, he was doing fill-in work for Marvel and DC. So this is really at the start of his career, which has continued across mostly Marvel, but both publishers and some independents where he created Astro City. Todd Smith has done a good number of comics, though for his skill, I would love to see him doing more or having done more. He did Vigilante a little later in the DC run of Vigilante, mostly doing DC in the 80s, does some Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, and then he does some Marvel in the early 90s, including obviously these 2 issues, then stops on most major publisher comic books, does the Zorro comic strip, and I actually couldn't find much more information about Todd. So that's some background on the creators. Since this is a really complex, I'd say, 2-issue what if, why don't we give a summary of the first issue and talk a little bit about that before we talk about where it goes?
Okay, so cold open. Charles, Jean, and Scott are killed by a bomb, and the murderer is Cable. Dun dun dun. Jump back in time, and Charles has returned from the Shi'ar and thinks that the X-Men has wasted his legacy in his absence. After he threatens to strip Cable from his leadership of the New Mutants, Cable and his protégés escape. Charles vows to track down Cable, but Cable kills him first. That's the cold open. This causes a splinter between Storm and Wolverine, who wants revenge, as the team splinters in 2. Chaos reigns now as every villain from Apocalypse to Mr. Sinister to the Hellfire Club make their move in Charles's absence, bringing the Fantastic Four and the Avengers along for the ride. Wolverine and Cable face off in a confrontation, and Logan kills Cable. With the world in disarray, Magneto swoops in to pick up the pieces.
Yeah, okay. This is, I mean, it's an epic what if, right?
Yes.
Like, there is so much. Before we dig into it or even react to it, I want to talk a little bit about the point of divergence.
Mm-hmm.
I struggle with it. What is the point of divergence here? It's almost like what Busiek is doing is saying, what if Charles was a jerk? Which is interesting because Charles is a jerk. Like, it's just so, it's very fascinating to me. And we know that what ifs tend to either have a really clear point of divergence or not at all. And that's fine. I get that. But here, like, Uatu even gives us a little bit of the background from what we read from the Claremont and Lee. Like, he's telling us, like, oh, Xavier was away, he was with the Shi'ar, but what if But then obviously the question is not the point of Divergence. What if Cable had destroyed the X-Men? Like, it's in fact Charles who sets this all off, because Charles is such a jerk about Cable, like an incomprehensible jerk. Now, Charles is a terrible person, and all of us who've read the X-Men for decades know that to be true. But here, he's like, it doesn't make any sense. He actually like tells the X-Men to go capture him. And that's why Cable turns on them. Like, it really makes no sense to me.
Yeah, and then there's some X-Men, like Wolverine doesn't like what Charles is saying either, but Wolverine sticks by Charles still. So, like, there's some depth even within how the different characters react to how Charles is being. But I, too, was taken aback by, like, wow, like, you, like, as some of the characters say, like Bobby and Wolverine say, like, you haven't been here, buddy, so why are you complaining so much?
Well, and then Xavier threatens to shut down Cable's mind during the battle.
Yes.
He projects himself into his head and says, if I have to shut down your mind, and Cable's like, no, I'm going to get you. And you want a war, like, you'll get a war. So it really is, again, it's not too distant from choices Xavier has made over the years, but I don't fully get the point of Divergence. It's almost like the War Skrull Xavier stayed Xavier. I kind of wish that's what Kurt Busiek was doing here. Like, Xavier, the real, is actually still trapped up with the War Skrulls, and this was the fake one who got killed by Cable, but was not actually Xavier.
That'd be interesting.
So strange to me.
Because Charles even says, Cable, like, I think you're as bad as Magneto and some of these other people. And it's like, well, why does he believe that? I mean, I don't know fully, like, the background with all these characters as much as you do, of course, but it still seems like that's a big jump. So I love, like, your explanation of, like, oh, what if he was just, and even then you could go, well, maybe the Skrull is actually trying to sow the seeds of discontent amongst the team, right? Like, he's coming back being an asshole on purpose, so everyone fractures, and it's exactly what happens, but he doesn't expect to be killed. Like, that's an interesting story right there.
Yeah, and ultimately that's kind of what happens, because I'd say the question of what if Cable had destroyed the X-Men, I'm sure as a fan you were sort of imagining, if you read that cover, you were thinking, oh, like, ooh, this what if is going to somehow have us have Cable kill all the X-Men. He doesn't. He ends up ultimately instigating the destruction of the X-Men, because by splintering them, which really is Charles's fault, but fine, let's say it's Cable, by splintering them off, some of them go to confront Cable, but he actually just sort of wants to defend himself. Like, he just goes with the New Mutants to hide out. He's not attacking the X-Men or anything. It's then the villains who take this opportunity to attack all of the weakened X-Men. And we get, like, these multiple splash pages, which I really like, where it's just like, oh, here's what Sebastian Shaw is doing to take advantage of this. And here's what the Shadow King is doing to take advantage. So you see, like, everyone come out. So Cable's having destroyed the X-Men is what you're saying, like, this idea that he sort of inadvertently caused this fracturing, this splintering, and that led to their destruction. It's not like he kills them all. It's not like a what if Deadpool killed the Marvel Universe kind of situation.
Yeah. And it was interesting bringing in the non-X-Men characters like the Fantastic Four and the Avengers as well there too, because I don't feel like I see those characters maybe because the X-Men universe is just so big and there's so many X-Men characters, like, you don't often will then see, like, Thor interacting with Strong Guy, which is what happens here. But, like, I guess because they're trying to have it obviously be this huge global story in that way, it would only make logical sense to bring in these other non-X-Men characters as well.
Well, it's where I think Busiek's world building here is so useful, because again, we have these splash pages in this first issue with these other characters. And, like, the way we get the Fantastic Four pulled in is that actually Strife and the Mutant Liberation Front end up deciding that they are sentencing the Fantastic Four to death. And so they decide they're going to go attack them. And that all happens on like one panel of a page.
Yeah.
I like want that story. Like Kurt clearly had just so many ideas that he's putting together in this world as like, ultimately the question is what would happen if the X-Men were distracted is ultimately what the question here is. And that's what's so cool to pull all these people in. So,
But I think he brings in that other great thing that I was thinking about before, when it's like, I don't always love when they get super global. I love when they get down to earth. And I think it's like the thing of like, you could see this happening in real life, or you do see this happening in real life with protests and stuff like that, where all of the because of all this happening, the normal not powered people are looking up at and going, wait, why everyone's fighting now? Like, this is making me not like the mutants. Like at the core of this is the mutants' fault, because they're the thing that's connecting all of this. And I think that's just so smart, where it's like, otherwise the humans were just kind of minding their own business, but now this is starting to impede on their world, and they're looking for a scapegoat.
You see like one woman whose son accidentally gets killed in one of the battles.
Yes.
And like you just see that one panel. But yeah, you definitely now have like, okay, we don't just have the factions amongst the X-Men, we have all the villains. And now we also have Earth's human population, which is going to be really important for the second part. So why don't we bring the summary in for the second part, and then we can talk about this whole story.
Okay, so Magneto unites the mutants around him, yay! And eventually takes the US government hostage, boo. Or maybe not. While Magneto thinks the US has surrendered, the president launches a Sentinel strike. Soon, however, the Sentinels get out of hand and begin to capture or kill not just mutants, but anyone who could give birth to a mutant and the heroes who protect the mutants, leading to global martial law. Still, the Sentinels cannot defeat Magneto, who easily defeats them time and time again, until one day, Magneto destroys a Sentinel that housed a secret atomic bomb, setting off an explosion that kills him, most of the X-Men, and destroys Washington, D.C. Many heroes, including Spider-Man and Iron Man and most of the X-Men, are all cut down or captured, but Wolverine remains, and with the help of a dying Sebastian Shaw, evades the Sentinels, freeing an odd bunch of Iceman, Siren, La Bandera, Amphibious, and Sunder to form a new X-Men.
Yeah, and we close on a splash page of the X-Men Live Again with that team lineup.
Which I'm sure is the only time we've ever seen that team line up.
It sure is. So
I don't even know who La Bandera is. Who
she's Cuban,
Oh, that's fun.
So okay, let's talk now about the whole thing. So general reactions now.
Oh gosh, I definitely did not see the atomic bomb part coming. So that was so surprising and dark, and I just thought it also was just so seamlessly, I mean, I know it's a two-parter, so it should make sense, but I just thought it so seamlessly was what the escalation of part one would be here, with like focusing now on Magneto, who's pretty much almost entirely absent from the first part of the story, and it's just like, oh yeah, this is how this would naturally escalate.
Well, the other thing that I think Busiek does here, which is why he's just a legendary writer at this point, is he is like a chess master, because Magneto taking over the USA doesn't totally make sense if we accept any version of an anti-hero Magneto, like other than the arch villain Magneto, which has usually been retconned to be not Magneto double anyway. It doesn't make total sense. So instead, what you have here is like, yeah, Magneto's going to swoop in and take over, because he's like, this is out of control and this is ridiculous and people are dying. And yet then it's the humans who was set up in the first issue, as you described, to hate everything that's happening, who've created these Sentinels, and that becomes the war then. So you have why Magneto is going to consolidate, if you will, the mutant army, and now has to fight against the humans and the Sentinels, because otherwise, like, Magneto wouldn't have aggressively, violently done the things that he had to do. He was more, even in the end, like you said, the atomic bomb, he's more protecting himself. He's more like, no, I'm going to make sure that the war stops, that it's safe for mutants. I will occupy Washington, D.C. or the White House in order to do that. And I'm just going to destroy the Sentinels as they come. But that's it. Like, I'm not out to kill every human. And so it makes sense with the characters. Like, every piece locks in here and makes sense with the characters, even though it's such a short 2 issues.
Yeah. And I think so much with the Sentinels too, it reminds me of the thing that comes up all the time around fascism. Like, first they came for the so-and-so and I did nothing. And it's very much that story here where the humans are launching the Sentinels thinking, okay, they're going to take care of the mutant problem. But then the Sentinels start coming for the humans. And it also has so many things that are making me think about AI today too, where like, oh, we're relying on these machines to solve the problem, but the machines only think in one very specific way. They're only thinking, how can I get that end result? And they're going to do whatever they can to get that end result, which might include killing a lot of humans in the process. And I think it's just such an interesting kind of apocalypse, not the character, but the world apocalypse story that Busiek is being able to weave here.
Well, and one of the coolest things is that's of course the story of Days of Future Past.
Oh,
and they
yes,
actually
yeah.
have Storm here refer to that and talk about like, oh, you know, there was once this alternate future where this started happening. We have to stop it. And you see all these strands of it. They're putting people into different internment camps, and they're, as you said, setting up martial law. So I think it's really cool that this can't quite be a pre-story or a prologue to Days of Future Past, because the characters we need are dead or are not part of this. But I love that the echoes are there, and that Kurt had a character named that, because I was reading it and was like, wait a second, this is really leading us to Days of Future Past, but can't. And so that's in there too. So yeah, there's something about this story that is sort of archetypal, I guess.
Totally. And we talked a lot about Kurt's work, but what do you think about Todd Smith's art here? Because it's very different in style to the Jim Lee art.
Oh, I don't think it's that different. I think the skill level is slightly different, but I actually really like it because I think it's quite similar. I think that the inking isn't too bad. Maybe it's the coloring feels really flat here, and it's probably that they were not putting a lot of money into What If at the time. So I think that might be part of it. This is also an issue that's not been remastered digitally. It's one of the weird volume 2 What Ifs that's not available digitally. So you're reading it on 30-year-old newsprint. So it doesn't look great, but I really like his art. I think he does the lines Jim does to get like the whole body in movement, to get lots of action in a short space. There's so many battles that are taking place on like one panel with like 20 characters. And some, they're not, he doesn't have the level of detail Jim does. And that might be just time, not skill, because I'm sure this was a rushed issue or not given the time that it might have needed. But there have to be at least 100 characters across these 2 books. And so I really like it.
Oh, me too. No, I don't think it has like the exaggerated physiques as much as some of the Jim Lee stuff do. Like, I feel like I look at this and I see more classic comic book look of like a generation earlier to me. I don't know if like you agree.
It's slightly cartoonier, but I think that's more in the inking and the coloring, honestly. I think the penciling is pretty similar. I think you would see those physiques, but I think the it's not given the same detail that, like, there's a reason Jim Lee has had Scott Williams ink almost everything he's done for the 40 years. And I think that's part of why. So, yeah, I think it's similar in all the good ways.
Yeah, and there's just some great, like, splash pages, like when the Sentinels first come out as well, the atomic bomb, just all the different battles that are happening after Charles's death. Like you said, like, sometimes you look at a page and it looks like there's 50 characters, not even just background characters, but like named characters. And then there's some weird ones. There's like the Vanisher, right? Isn't that one of the ones who's like in, like, there's a few
There's
weird
so many,
ones
I don't even know.
that are just like thrown in there.
Yeah, and even then the non-mutant characters of the Avengers and the Fantastic Four, and I see Eternals there. I mean, Cersei was probably at this point on the Avengers, but there's so many characters. It's almost epic. It just doesn't have room to breathe to actually feel totally epic. Which,
but it doesn't
I guess
feel...
would be my only complaint, but I'm not complaining.
No.
I would have taken more, which we can talk about in a minute when we're wrapping up if we want more and what that looks like. But
yeah, it doesn't feel rushed in the way that some of the what ifs that we've covered, where they're cramming a lot in here. I think because it has the 2 issues. Like, if for some reason they tried to get this all into 1 issue, I couldn't even imagine how they do it. But I think the 2 issues gives it just enough room to breathe, where it leaves you wanting more, but at the same time it doesn't overstay its welcome either.
Yeah. So do you want more Earth 21993?
Well, I don't know all of those characters very well who end up being the new X-Men.
So they're so wacky. Like, that is reason
are.
in and of itself to want it, right? Like, he took Amphibious, who's a mutate. He took Bandera, who has barely shown up. She was in Wolverine. She's a Cuban freedom fighter who's been in like 5 total issues her entire existence. Siren, Sunder, who again, like, doesn't show up too much, is connected to Sinister, and Iceman. So, like, you have these just random, you have the OG Iceman, then 2nd gen Wolverine, and then you have these other iterations from time. So I love how random his choices were. He was clearly not trying to produce a team that looked anything like the team we knew at this point.
Yeah. I think I'm happy where it ended, but at the same time, I think I could see more stories. I'd like to see what other super oddball characters out there haven't been captured. And from a more story point of view, I'd love to see, how does Wolverine partner with humans? Because at this point, humans are in almost as bad of a place as the mutants are.
Right.
So how do
they be willing to resist?
Exactly.
At this point?
Yeah. And what do they do to, like, take down the Sentinels? Because it does leave it at a cliffhanger in that way. So I think that would be an interesting story to continue to do, and especially if they're able to pull in more of these. I was going to say backbench. I was going to say like C list, but some of them are even like D list characters.
Oh yeah, I don't know what Z list. I guess is where we need to go for some of them. So yeah, I agree. I would totally be fine with a sequel. I would also be fine with an expanded version of this, because, like I said, I think there's a lot of beats, especially in that first issue, where I want to know, like, what happens between Strife and the Fantastic Four. I want to know what Shadow King is doing and why what his plan actually is, that we see in barely 1 panel. Then we even get reference to the fact that Banshee got killed, and Magan got killed, Captain Britain's wife. We don't know how. Like, there's so much that we could just see if this could be a 12-issue maxi series. So I'd like them to bring it back.
Well, before the Sentinels shut us down for being mutant lovers, let's ponder some possibilities.
Will the future you describe be averted, averted?
Oh, an X-Men 97 clip. Oh, that's interesting. Because, Guido, what are we talking about for our pondering possibilities?
Well, no, that was not X-Men 97. X-Men 97 is not out yet. That was X-Men 92.
The X-Men 92.
All right.
X-Men from the
Well,
90s. Okay.
The X-Men are coming. The X-Men are coming. So we only have a few minutes left in our episode, but X-Men 97 is about to be out. We know that Wolverine and we know confirmed other Fox X folks are going to be in the MCU or some alternate universe connected to the MCU and Deadpool. So let's return to our ongoing pondering of possibilities that we've done a few times before of all things X. What do we want from these projects that are on on a horizon close to us, and where are we headed with Marvel's Merry Mutants?
Well, I think the one thing I've realized as being someone who liked the X-Men but didn't know them nearly as well as you did is that there's so many stories, so many characters to tell, and it feels like in the movies and in some of the animated things, they've told a finite amount of those stories, and sometimes we've heard the same story like over and over again, especially in the movies. So I think like it would be really fun to go into some of these deeper cuts and like give us some characters we've never seen, give us some stories that we've never seen, because there's so much to play with. What would do you think that would be a good approach?
Yeah, I agree totally. And I was thinking that, I mean, I think I've said that before on here as someone who's a huge fan of House of X and the Krakoa era. Like, I would love to see that. I'd love to see this idea of like, how do we live without Charles, or what happens if our villain sort of becomes an anti-hero and our mentor with Magneto. And we've seen strands of some of those in the First Class era trilogy, but reading the Lee and Claremont today that we read for today, I was thinking like, I hope that they lean into a deep lore, a rich world built with just dozens of characters and tons of connections. And what Claremont does, and many other creators who've worked on X-Men, not just Claremont, but Claremont being the most famous and longest run of it, is the thing that I love, and we've talked about on this show so many times. I love stories that are ambitious and trust their audience. And I think a really good X-Men, to me, is going to do that. It's going to say, like, we're not going to water this down. We're not going to prepackage this into a little bit like, oh, mutants are hated and feared and they live at this school. Like, we don't need to do that anymore. People know the X-Men. There's a baseline in the same way that they did a little bit with Spider-Man, in the same way that DC's moving past, like, Batman's origin and Superman's origin. Like, we get it. We know that. Now give us some really multi-layered, complex stories with these characters, and that's what I am hopeful for. And even reading something like Psylocke, which is a very controversial decision, and I know we will never see it in the MCU, but I'm like, just the audacity of the stuff that Claremont was doing. I want my on-screen mutants to be equally bold and audacious.
Well, interesting. I'm making me think now, like, aside from like Deadpool and Wolverine, which is kind of gonna be a one-off in that way and probably will lead to other things as we've discussed on past episodes, but do you think that the X-Men then, for the future of the X-Men in the MCU, do you think that they shouldn't be in a movie form? Like, do you think because of the soap opera kind of storytelling that especially Claremont pioneered, do you think it would be better to do it as a television series and forget about doing a movie?
I mean, I feel like this has been a 30-year conversation amongst X fans because the animated series did it so well and was rather remarkable in a landscape of children's animated shows that really didn't permit serialized storytelling. They somehow, like I said, with the Savage Land, and then finally when they got the green light for stuff like the Phoenix Saga, they were able to tell these huge arcs over many episodes. So I think people have always wondered, like, does this world of X-Men need to be a TV show? And then, of course, we have a few failed attempts at doing that on TV from Fox. But I think it can be done in movies. I mean, the MCU itself, especially, let's just consider the first phase of it, or I'd say the first few phases of it, but the Infinity Saga, there were strands in that were pulled over years, and it worked. there were threads of people's relationships that got picked up years later, or that we only saw a little part of. So I think it's possible. It might be really, really hard, and it would probably be easier in a TV show or like miniseries type arc. But I think we're going to get a movie, and I think they just have to be ready. I don't know, maybe they have to like write and maybe even shoot like a trilogy of X-Men movies. And
or I'm
sort
thinking
of approach it differently, because they've never done that other than Infinity War Endgame being split. And even those they were filmed close together, but they weren't filmed at the same time like the Lord of the Rings was. So maybe that's the solution, is like, don't think of it as one movie, but don't think of it as a TV show, because that's not quite the same. Think of it as multiple movies, and let's write these all together, and let's maybe even put them in production together. That'd be kind of cool.
Well, I'm thinking too, I wonder if they could do something like do a 10-episode television series, and then the conclusion is a theatrically released movie or something like that. That's also something they've never done. Like, let us get the characters, let us get the soap opera through a TV show. And because so much of the X-Men too, I think in rereading this, it's all about those interpersonal relationships. And it would take at least one movie to kind of get to where you need to be for telling some of the story. So maybe do that in a TV show, and then it culminates in like one big giant epic movie that's telling like one story, but it's utilizing the relationships and the characterizations that we've gotten over the course of like 6 to 10 episodes of a TV show.
Yeah, I think, I can't remember, maybe we didn't talk about it on the show, but I know I've talked about that, I think with Elliot. That was sort of our plan, is we said like, let's do a TV show, that's where the character stuff lives, and then do like an Inferno movie. So you have this TV show that's the foundation of this world, these characters and how they exist. And then you have this movie that's Inferno. And sure, people could go see Inferno and not having watched the TV show, and maybe won't get it as much, but maybe still enjoy it as like some, dark, mystical, epic event. But put the events in the movies and have the world exist in TV. I guess it's possible. Who knows?
We'll see in 2030.
Yeah, I know.
Yes.
X-Men 97 is going to be a fun start to get a sense of what the current Marvel Studios want to do with these characters. I think it's going to give us some good clues, and I think it's going to do some interesting stuff. And so we'll see in just a matter of weeks.
Can't wait.
Well, that is a wrap.
That's a wrap.
Watchers. Thank you for listening. I've been Guido.
And I have been Rob.
The reading list is in the show notes. Follow us at Dear Watchers. We're mostly on Instagram and Threads.
And leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts, especially Apple Music and Spotify. We'll be back soon with another trip through the multiverse.
In the meantime, in the words of Uatu, keep pondering the possibilities.